She was 19, a peasant girl who had turned the course of a war, and now she sat chained to a rough wooden block inside a stone cell, watched by men who had once been her enemies. The image is simple and terrible. A young woman who had crowned a king reduced to a single knot of rope and oak. What they did to Joan of Arc in that cell, day after day, hour after hour, was more than preparation for death. It was an assault on everything that made her who she was, her body, her faith, and her dignity. That is the claim of this story. The guard's treatment amounted to a torment in its own right, a slow, relentless stripping of personhood that, in many ways, was worse than the flames that would come later. Joan's rise was as improbable as it was decisive. A shepherd's daughter from Domremy, she claimed to hear saints. She convinced commanders and common soldiers alike that she was a sign. In campaign after campaign, she pressed forward, lifting the siege of Orleans, rallying a shaken French court, and leading the king into his coronation at Reims. For the English and their Burgundian allies, she became more than a battlefield nuisance. She became a symbol, a living embodiment of French resistance. Symbols are dangerous in war because they can outlast armies. They turn victories into stories. Neutralizing Joan would not merely remove a leader, it would attempt to erase a story that kept resistance alive. That is why, in 1430, when a Burgundian force captured her near Compiègne, she was not treated as an ordinary prisoner of war. She was sold to the English and moved into their custody, eventually arriving in Rouen, the city that would host her trial. From the moment she passed into English hands, her fate was shaped by political calculation. The English needed legitimacy and the removal of a rallying figure. What followed, imprisonment, trial, and execution, was theater staged to repudiate her claim to divine mission and to make her death appear lawful. The cell where Joan spent months before her condemnation was not merely a cramped, cold room. According to the later rehabilitation trial of 1456, and to contemporary accounts preserved in trial records, she was kept in conditions that violated the norms of the time. Canon law, the Church's own rules for handling accused heretics and ecclesiastical procedure, called for women suspected of heresy to be guarded by women, when possible, and for accused clergy to have access to sacraments and spiritual counsel. Joan received neither protection nor pastoral care in the way those provisions anticipated. Instead, testimony later recorded speaks of male soldiers posted constantly near, and at times inside, her cell. She was bound to a wooden block for portions of her imprisonment and, on occasion, placed in shackles. Witnesses later testified to the taunts and mockery she endured, men jeering at her, seeking to provoke confusion and shame. When she asked for priests and for confession, she was delayed or denied. When she requested the presence of women to guard her or help with prayers and personal matters, those requests were ignored. The effect was cumulative, a deprivation not only of bodily comfort, but of the spiritual means by which she had understood herself. For Joan, whose life and courage were anchored in prayer and visions, separation from sacramental consolation was not a small inconvenience. It was a cutting away of the thing that sustained her identity. There was also a persistent gendered threat. Medieval records make clear the practical reasons Joan gave for wearing men's clothing while imprisoned: to protect herself in a hostile environment of male soldiers, and to preserve modesty in a situation where female guardians were unavailable. In that time and place, men's garments could function as a kind of armor, not only for the body but for social standing. Clothing influenced how one was treated and what protections one might command. Yet the very clothing that had kept her safe became a legal snare. The tribunal framed her habit as evidence of irreligion or deception. Her continued wearing of male attire was repeatedly brought up as a point of accusation and scandal. Accounts from the period and testimony later given at the rehabilitation hearing record a pattern. Guards would jeer at her, attempt to provoke her into what they called shameful acts, and according to some witnesses, one high-ranking English lord made a physical attempt against her person. That particular allegation survives in testimony and should be treated as such, an accusation recorded by witnesses who later appeared before the church that reopened her case. It is not an incontrovertible, detail-by-detail reconstruction of actions that cannot be questioned. But whether or not every element of that testimony can be proven beyond dispute, multiple depositions agree on the pattern: persistent harassment, threats, and an environment in which Joan feared for her physical and sexual safety. In such conditions, men's clothing was not mere affectation, it was a survival strategy. The tribunal itself, headed by Bishop Pierre Cochon, acting on behalf of English interests, did not proceed like an impartial ecclesiastical court. Procedural irregularities accumulate in the records. The trial was transferred to a venue under English control. Joan was at times denied counsel of her choosing, and questions were posed in ways that many later critics called designed to trap her into theological error. The interrogators fixated on technicalities. What did she mean by saying she had visions? Had she asked God for forgiveness and received grace? Under canon law terms, the precise timing and understanding of grace could determine whether a statement was heretical or simply a mistaken phrasing. The judges pressed these subtleties relentlessly. They asked about visions, angels, and whether she acknowledged church authority. They raised the subject of the clothing repeatedly. Why did she wear men's garments? Was she deceiving men? Could she be trusted to submit to ecclesiastical direction? The pressure was enormous. At one point, Joan signed an abjuration, a formal renunciation of the things for which she had been accused. Abjuration in medieval legal practice could restore an accused person to the church if done sincerely. Joan's abjuration was recorded. She accepted certain formulations that the court found acceptable and promised to live modestly in women's clothing. But the circumstances of that abjuration are contested. Some later witnesses insisted it was made under coercion, under promises and threats, while others argued that she signed it deliberately to gain a reprieve. After the abjuration, she was sentenced not to death but to imprisonment, with specific instructions about attire. What followed is a crucial and painful ambiguity. Shortly after her abjuration, records indicate that she resumed wearing men's clothing. Why did this happen? Two accounts coexist. One thread of testimony suggests she was frightened and that the absence of female guardians, combined with threats and attempted assaults, made her revert to men's garments for protection. Another version argues that she changed back by her own choice and therefore violated her abjuration. The truth may lie somewhere between, an act driven by fear, survival instincts, and the chaotic environment of her confinement. The court treated the resumption of men's dress as a relapse. By returning to what they called scandalous apparel, she had effectively rejected her abjuration. Under the laws they applied, a relapsed heretic could be handed over to the secular arm for punishment, including execution. There is something deeply perverse in this legal logic. The tribunal set the ground rules, then used the hazards they had created: male guards inside the cell, the lack of women's protection, the psychological strain, to claim that Joan's response to those dangers proved her insincerity. A formal renunciation signed under duress or in hope of time could be turned, by the same authorities that extracted it, into proof of relapse. Procedural fairness was weaponized into a rope. Once the ecclesiastical judges declared her a relapsed heretic, Joan was delivered to secular authorities to be burned. The execution itself, while terrible, was not the whole of the punishment. It was the final chapter of a longer cruelty. Contemporary accounts describe Joan's last moments with solemnity. She was given a cross, an image of the very faith she professed. She kissed it. She was tied to a pillar or stake, bound in public, and the fire was lit. Witnesses recorded that her final cry was the name of Jesus. The smoke rose. In an act intended to prevent her from becoming a relic or a focus of veneration, those in charge gathered her ashes and cast them into the Seine, or scattered them. Accounts vary, so that no shrine could be made. They hoped to erase her from memory. They failed. The attempt to erase a life by burning the body and dispersing the ashes underestimated the power of narrative. Within a quarter century, voices that had been silenced or pushed aside returned. In 1456, a formal rehabilitation trial, convened by the papacy, examined the original proceedings, heard dozens of witnesses, and concluded that Joan's 1431 condemnation had been marred by procedural error, by bias, and by irregularities incompatible with genuine ecclesiastical justice. The rehabilitation did not undo suffering, but it established that the legal edifice that had produced her sentence was corrupt. Eventually, centuries later, the Church would canonize Joan of Arc in 1920. The execution had failed at its deeper purpose. Rather than obliterating her, it transformed her into a martyr and a lasting symbol. So where does the claim that what the guards did to Joan was worse than death come from? It rests on a careful reading of the record and a moral interpretation rather than sensational exaggeration. Consider what was taken from her long before the flames: control over her own body and clothing, the ability to practice her faith with confidants and clergy, the social protections due to an accused woman, and the chance to speak without questions engineered to trap her. She was confined in close quarters with men who mocked and threatened her, sometimes bound to a block, deprived of sacraments that had anchored her, and placed in a context in which any defensive act could be reclassified as obstinacy or heresy. Those conditions corrode a person's sense of self. They replace agency with dependency and conscience with calculation. For someone whose authority rested on a conviction of divine mission and on the spiritual life, being cut off from prayer, confession, and the company of faithful women could feel like a ripping of the soul. Humiliation, public, continuous, and gendered, works over time. It teaches a person that their voice will not be heard fairly, that their body is not safeguarded, that their faith is negotiable. The tribunal then formalized that humiliation, making the very acts of survival into legal evidence of guilt. We should be careful here. Worse than death is not a simple comparative statement about physical suffering at the stake. Fire burns, smoke chokes. Yet death is, in one way, finite. The months Joan endured in that cell were not finite in the same way. They were an ongoing series of small violences that dismantled trust and dignity. A single execution can be swift. An environment of continuous degradation is not. For Joan, being forced into choices between physical safety and doctrinal peril, being denied the very sacraments that defined her existence, and being subject to men's mockery and alleged assaults, all while lawyers and bishops twisted procedure to produce a desired verdict, these were injuries to her personhood and to the faith she lived by. The chain on her ankle and the block under her knees were physical, but the deeper binding was to fear, isolation, and institutional betrayal. There is also the betrayal by institutions that were supposed to be guardians of conscience. The Church, in principle, offered processes meant to seek truth, to allow confession and reconciliation, to protect the vulnerable. When those processes were bent to political ends, when bishops sat as instruments of occupation rather than impartial judges, the justice system that might have repaired a social wound instead became a tool of further harm. That institutional abuse compounds individual cruelty. It tells the victim that there is no arbiter left to appeal to, that the nets have been woven by those who claim to be your protectors. We must register uncertainty where the record is uncertain. Some names, places, and minor details are corrupted in surviving transcripts. Certain castle names or spellings appear mangled in copies and must be checked against primary sources. Where testimony conflicts, on whether an assault was attempted, on the precise reasons she resumed men's clothing, we present both accounts and let the balance of testimony and later legal finding guide interpretation. The 1456 rehabilitation trial, in revisiting these testimonies, concluded that the original process had been tainted and that Joan had been denied essential protections. That judgment is a powerful corrective to the 1431 verdict and underpins much of the modern understanding of what she endured. This is not merely an intellectual exercise about medieval procedure. It is a moral question we can still ask today. If institutional power is used to isolate, humiliate, and convert acts of survival into proof of guilt, have we not committed a violence that extends beyond physical injury? When a person's ability to pray, to seek counsel, and to preserve bodily integrity is systematically stripped away, the harm is existential. It ruins not only life, but the inner architecture by which life is made meaningful. Joan's final cry, Jesus, is both testimony and defiance. In naming the one who had guided her, she reclaimed, in the moment of death, the faith that was denied to her in the months before. The attempt to consume her body and scatter her ashes could not extinguish the memory of a woman who had moved nations by conviction. Instead, the very methods intended to demean her, public spectacle, legal manipulation, and social shaming, helped to burn her story into the conscience of generations. Ask yourself, which is the greater crime against a human being? One solemn execution carried out under a formal sentence, or a prolonged campaign of humiliation and denial that leaves the person stripped of spiritual solace and social standing before the final act? The historical record invites the conclusion that, for Joan, the slow work of degradation inside that cell was an injury of a different order. It not only prepared the body for death, it tried to break the soul that animated the body. History also shows irony. The effort to erase Joan turned the attempted obliteration into a process of sanctification. The rehabilitation trial of 1456 declared the earlier sentence flawed and politically motivated. The Church's later canonization in 1920 consecrated her memory in a way the English court had tried to prevent. In the end, the guards and judges who sought to neutralize a symbol ensured, through their own methods, that the symbol would endure. If this story matters to you, subscribe for more deep dives into pivotal moments where law, faith, and power collide. where the means of justice become the instruments of injustice. For now, remember Joan not only as a martyr at the stake, but as a woman who endured a different kind of violence in a cell, a sustained attack on her dignity, her faith, and her agency. That sustained violence is why many historians, looking at the evidence and the later rehabilitation, argue that what happened in her cell was in many ways worse than death itself. If you want to explore how the rehabilitation came together, or to see the primary sources scholars rely on, watch our next video on the 1456 retrial, and check the pinned sources in the description for documents and translations.